The valley was silent except for the wind. Far below the ridgeline, 6 Navy SEALs pressed their backs against cold stone, watching the tree line with weapons raised and breath held. They had been compromised 3 hours earlier. The exfil helicopter that was supposed to lift them out had taken an RPG through the tail rotor and crashed 8 miles north. Now they were surrounded by an estimated 40 Taliban fighters closing in from 3 directions. The team leader, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, checked his watch. 12 minutes of daylight left. He keyed his radio twice, the signal prearranged, and waited for the response that never came. Above them, the sky was bruising into purple and gold, beautiful in a way that felt wrong given the circumstances. The mountains had swallowed their communications. They were alone. What none of them knew yet was that 200 miles away, a single A-10 Thunderbolt II was already turning hard toward their coordinates. The pilot had been flying a routine patrol along the Pakistani border when the distress call broke through on the emergency frequency. It was garbled, half static, but the coordinates were clear enough. 6 men, surrounded. No air support available. Every other asset was committed to operations further south. The pilot didn't hesitate. She pushed the throttles forward and dove low, skimming the peaks, flying in a way that would have gotten her grounded in peacetime. Her call sign was Valkyrie 1. Her real name was Captain Nora Kine, and she had been told once, by a squadron commander who didn't think she could hear him, that women pilots were fine for transport but not for the kind of flying that got your hands dirty. She remembered that now as she checked her weapons load. 290 rounds of 30mm ammunition in the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 4 Maverick missiles, a pair of Hydra rocket pods, enough to make a difference, enough to die trying. The sun was setting fast, and she was flying alone into a valley she had never seen, toward men she had never met, with no backup and no guarantee that she would make it back. The A-10 was built to take punishment, but it was also built to deliver it, and Nora Kine intended to do both. She checked her instruments, adjusted her heading, and began her descent. The valley appeared ahead, a dark gash in the mountains. Somewhere down there, 6 men were counting their last rounds. She keyed her radio. Valkyrie 1 inbound. Her voice was steady, calm, almost bored. It was the voice of someone who had done this before, though she had not like this, not alone. The SEALs didn't hear the radio call. Their communications were still down, jammed or destroyed by the same forces that had shot down their helicopter. Marcus Hale was calculating angles now, deciding which direction to break when the shooting started. His radio man, Petty Officer First Class Javier Santos, was next to him, still trying to raise anyone on the backup frequencies. The other 4 operators were spread along the rocks, watching the forest below where shadows were beginning to move. They had maybe 5 minutes before contact, maybe less. The Taliban fighters were taking their time, knowing the Americans had nowhere to go, enjoying the slow collapse of the trap. One of the SEALs, a sniper named Derek Grant, spotted movement 200 meters out and clicked his tongue twice against his teeth. Everyone froze. The movement stopped, then started again, faster now, more confident. They were coming. Nora Kine saw the valley spread beneath her like a photograph. The ridgeline, the trees, the thin column of smoke still rising from somewhere to the north, probably the crashed helicopter. She dropped lower, pushing the A-10 down until she was flying barely 500 feet above the peaks, the aircraft shuddering in the turbulence. The Warthog was not graceful. It was blunt, ugly, designed by people who cared more about function than form. The massive cannon was mounted in the nose, the engine set high and back to avoid ingesting debris, the entire airframe built around the idea of survival. It could take hits that would shred other aircraft and still make it home. Nora loved it the way some people loved old dogs. She checked her targeting computer and began scanning for heat signatures. The valley was a mess of thermal noise, but she knew what to look for. Concentrations of movement, vehicles, weapons fire, anything that didn't belong. Then she saw them. 6 figures clustered against the rocks on the eastern ridge, barely visible even with infrared. And below them, scattered through the trees, dozens more moving upward in a slow, tightening ring. She keyed her radio again, broadcasting on every frequency she had. Any American forces in the valley, this is Valkyrie 1. If you can hear this, mark your position with infrared strobe. She waited, counting seconds, knowing they might not have the equipment or the time. Then faint but unmistakable, a flicker of infrared light appeared on the ridge. One flash, two, three, the signal. Nora exhaled and armed her weapons. "I've got you," she said, though no one could hear her. "I've got you." She rolled the A-10 hard to the left and began her attack run. The sun was almost gone now, the last light bleeding out across the horizon, and the valley below was falling into darkness. But darkness didn't matter to the Warthog. It had been built for exactly this. Marcus Hale saw the aircraft first, a dark shape moving fast and low across the ridgeline, silhouetted for just a moment against the dying light. He didn't recognize it immediately. His mind was focused on the threat below, on the figures moving through the trees, but then he heard it. The sound was unmistakable, a deep guttural roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, the twin turbofan engines of an A-10 Thunderbolt. He grabbed Santos by the shoulder and pointed. "Friendlies inbound." The words felt almost absurd given the situation, but they were real, and suddenly the odds didn't seem quite so impossible. The other SEALs looked up, and for a brief moment the tension that had been coiled in their chests loosened just slightly. Someone had come. The A-10 banked hard, turning back toward the valley, and then it opened fire. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon is not a subtle weapon. It fires 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 per second, and the sound it makes is like the sky being torn in half. The SEALs heard it before they saw the impact, a long, brutal BRRRRT that echoed off the mountains and seemed to shake the air itself. Then the tree line below them exploded. Dirt and wood and fire erupted in a line that cut through the forest like a chainsaw, and the figures that had been advancing froze, scattered, disappeared. The cannon fire walked through the trees, methodical and devastating, and when it stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Nora pulled up hard, climbing back into the sky, her hands steady on the controls. She checked her ammunition counter. 210 rounds left. She had fired in short bursts, disciplined, not wanting to waste what she had. The thermal scope showed movement still, figures breaking and running, but the advance had stopped. She keyed her radio again. "Valkyrie 1, targets suppressed. Stay low and mark any additional threats." She didn't know if they could hear her, but she said it anyway. On the ridge, Marcus Hale was already moving. The A-10's attack had bought them time, but it hadn't solved the problem. The Taliban fighters were still out there, still numerous, and now they knew there was air support. They would adapt, spread out, make themselves harder to hit. He gathered his team with quick hand signals and pointed toward a secondary position further up the ridge, a cluster of boulders that would give them better cover and a wider field of fire. They moved fast, low, weapons up, eyes scanning. Santos was still trying to raise the aircraft on the radio, cycling through frequencies, but the jamming was relentless. Nora circled wide, giving herself room to maneuver, watching the valley for any sign of regrouping. She saw vehicles now, 2 pickups moving along a dirt road on the western side, heading toward the ridge. Probably reinforcements. She locked onto the lead vehicle and fired a Maverick missile. The rocket streaked down, trailing smoke, and impacted directly on the truck's cab. The explosion was bright and sudden, a bloom of orange fire that lit up the valley for just a second. The second truck stopped, reversed, and disappeared back into the trees. Nora noted the position and continued her orbit. The SEALs reached the boulders and set up a defensive perimeter. Grant, the sniper, found a position with a clean line of sight down the slope and settled in with his rifle. The others spread out, checking their ammunition, reloading, preparing for the next wave. Hale looked at his watch again. Full darkness now. The stars were beginning to appear cold and distant. He could hear movement below, voices calling in Pashto, the sound of engines. The Taliban were regrouping, but slower now, more cautious. The A-10 had changed the equation. He didn't know who was flying it or how they had gotten there, but he was grateful. Santos finally got a signal through, weak and crackling, but enough. "Valkyrie 1, this is Grizzly 6, how copy?" The response came back almost immediately, clear and calm. "Grizzly 6, Valkyrie 1, I read you weak but clear. "What's your situation?" Santos glanced at Hale, who nodded. "We're holding position on the eastern ridge. Enemy forces scattered but still present. Estimate 30 to 40 fighters. We need close air support and immediate exfil." There was a pause, then the pilot's voice again. "Copy that, Grizzly 6. Exfil is inbound, ETA 20 minutes. I'll keep them off you until then." 20 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. Nora knew it was a lifetime. She checked her fuel. Enough for maybe 30 minutes of loitering, 40 if she pushed it, but pushing it meant risking a flameout on the return flight. She decided she would push it. The men on that ridge had no other options, and neither did she. She rolled into another attack run, this time targeting a group of fighters she had seen massing on the northern slope. She fired her cannon again, shorter bursts this time, conserving ammunition. The rounds chewed through the rocks and sent the fighters scrambling for cover. She pulled up, banked right, and came around for another pass. The A-10 was built for this kind of flying, low, slow, close to the enemy, but it required a level of focus that left no room for hesitation. Every decision had to be instant, every movement precise. She flew like someone who had been doing this for years, though the truth was more complicated. Nora Kine had graduated from the Air Force Academy 8 years earlier, third in her class with dreams of flying fighters. She had been assigned to the A-10 instead, a decision she had initially resented. The Warthog was not glamorous, it was not fast. It did not break the sound barrier or appear on recruiting posters, but over time she had come to understand what it was. It was honest. It was brutal. It did not pretend to be something it wasn't, and it saved lives. She had flown 63 combat missions in 2 deployments, most of them providing close air support to ground forces, and she had never lost anyone under her watch. That record mattered to her more than anything else. It was why she had turned toward the valley when the distress call came through, why she was flying alone into hostile territory with no backup and dwindling ammunition. Because 6 men were counting on her, and she would not let them down. The Taliban fighters were adapting now, spreading out into smaller groups, using the terrain to mask their movements. Nora saw the shift and adjusted her tactics. She stopped making long attack runs and started flying tighter circles, keeping herself overhead, forcing the enemy to stay hidden. It was a war of attrition now, and she intended to win it. She checked her fuel again. 25 minutes left. She keyed her radio. "Grizzly 6, what's your status?" Marcus Hale responded immediately. "Valkyrie 1, we're holding. No casualties. Enemy is probing our position but keeping distance." Nora allowed herself a brief moment of relief. "Copy that. Exfil is 15 minutes out. Stay tight." She didn't tell him how low her fuel was or how many rounds she had left. He didn't need that burden. She would carry it herself. On the ridge, the SEALs were beginning to believe they might actually make it. The sound of the A-10 circling overhead was constant now, a reassuring growl that kept the enemy at bay. Grant had taken 2 shots, both clean kills, and the rest of the team had engaged targets sporadically, but the real protection was coming from above. The Warthog was a guardian, circling like some ancient predator, and the Taliban fighters knew it. They were waiting now, waiting for the aircraft to leave, waiting for an opening. But the opening never came. Nora flew tighter and tighter circles, her eyes locked on the thermal scope, her hands moving instinctively on the controls. She was operating on pure focus now, the kind of clarity that comes when everything else falls away and there is only the mission. She saw movement on the southern ridge, a group of 6 fighters setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun. She rolled toward them and fired a burst from the cannon. The gun disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. The exfil helicopter arrived exactly on time, a Marine Corps CH-53E coming in fast and low from the east. Nora saw it on her radar and keyed her radio. "Grizzly 6, your ride is here. Get ready to move." Marcus Hale acknowledged and signaled his team. They rose as one, moving quickly toward the extraction point, covering each other as they went. The helicopter flared hard and touched down on the ridge, rotors screaming, and the SEALs sprinted toward it. Nora kept circling, watching the tree line, ready to fire if anything moved. The Taliban fighters saw the helicopter and opened fire, small arms and RPGs, but they were too far away and too scattered to be effective. The SEALs boarded in less than 30 seconds, and the CH-53E lifted off, banking hard to the east and accelerating into the night. Nora watched them go, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She keyed her radio one last time. Grizzly 6 is clear. Valkyrie 1, RTB. She turned the A-10 toward home and began the long flight back to base. She landed with fumes in the tanks, the engines coughing as she taxied to the ramp. The ground crew met her with wide eyes, staring at the empty weapons pylons and the scorch marks along the fuselage where small arms fire had hit. She climbed out of the cockpit slowly, her legs stiff, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting. The crew chief approached her, shaking his head. "You flew into that alone." Nora nodded, too tired to speak. He looked at the aircraft, then back at her. "Ma'am, you're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest." She smiled faintly. "Probably both." She walked toward the debriefing room, her flight suit soaked with sweat, her mind already replaying every moment of the mission, looking for mistakes, looking for lessons. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had done the only thing she could do. The story of what happened in that valley spread quickly. The SEALs told it first, in their own debriefing, describing the lone A-10 that had appeared out of nowhere and held off an entire Taliban force for 20 minutes. The details were passed up the chain of command, and within days, Nora Kine's name was being mentioned in briefings at CENTCOM. The squadron commander who had once doubted her capability called her into his office and shook her hand without saying much, but the look in his eyes said enough. The other pilots treated her differently now, with a respect that was quiet but unmistakable. She had done something that most of them had only imagined, and she had done it alone. But Nora didn't talk about it much. She flew her missions, maintained her aircraft, and tried to process what had happened in the silence of her own thoughts. 3 weeks later, she received a message through official channels. The 6 SEALs wanted to meet her. They were back at their base in Virginia, and they had requested permission to fly out to her station in Afghanistan. The request was approved, and on a cold morning in late November, a C-130 landed at Bagram Airfield carrying the men she had saved. Nora met them on the flight line, feeling strangely nervous. She had seen them only as infrared shapes on a screen, and now they were standing in front of her, real and solid and alive. Marcus Hale stepped forward first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that came from years in the field. He extended his hand and she shook it. "Captain Kine," he said, his voice rough but sincere, "we owe you our lives." Nora shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job." He smiled slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am, that's bullshit. You flew into hell alone and pulled us out. That's not just doing your job, that's something else." The other SEALs introduced themselves one by one. Santos, the radio man who had been the one to finally make contact. Grant, the sniper who told her he had counted every burst of cannon fire and marveled at her accuracy. The others, whose names and faces she tried to commit to memory, each of them expressing gratitude in their own way. They stood on the tarmac for a long time, talking, trading stories, and slowly the strangeness faded. These were not strangers. They were brothers now, connected by a night in the mountains that none of them would ever forget. Before they left, Marcus Hale handed her something, a small wooden plaque, hand-carved with the SEAL trident embossed on it in a single line of text. "To Valkyrie 1 who rode the thunder and brought us home." Nora stared at it, her throat tight, and managed only a quiet thank you. They saluted her, she saluted back, and then they were gone, climbing back onto the C-130 and disappearing into the sky. Nora kept the plaque on the shelf in her quarters next to a photo of her father, who had been a pilot in Vietnam and had taught her to love flying before he died when she was 12. She thought about him often, wondered what he would say if he could see her now. She thought about the valley, the darkness, the way the A-10 had felt beneath her hands, solid and responsive and completely hers. She thought about the choice she had made, to turn toward the distress call instead of away from it, and she realized that it hadn't felt like a choice at all. It had felt inevitable, like the only possible thing to do. That realization stayed with her, shaping the way she flew, the way she thought about her role. She was not just a pilot. She was a lifeline. She was the voice on the radio that said, "I've got you." And she would carry that responsibility for as long as she could hold the stick. 6 months later, Nora Kine was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions that night. The ceremony was held at Bagram, attended by senior officers, fellow pilots, and a handful of journalists who had gotten wind of the story. She stood at attention while the medal was pinned to her uniform, feeling uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its importance. The citation was read aloud, describing her actions in formal, clinical language that somehow failed to capture the chaos and fear and sheer determination of those 20 minutes. When it was over, she shook hands, posed for photos, and answered questions from the reporters. One of them asked her if she had been scared. She paused, considering the question, then nodded. "Yes, I was terrified, but the men on that ridge were in worse shape than I was, so I did what I was trained to do." The reporter pressed further. "Do you think being a woman affected how people viewed your actions?" Nora smiled, a little sadly. "Probably, but it doesn't matter. The A-10 doesn't care who's flying it. It just cares that you know how to." The story reached the public eventually, as these stories always do. It was picked up by military blogs, then mainstream news outlets, then viral social media posts. Nora Kine became, for a brief moment, famous. Her face appeared in articles about women in combat, about the A-10's continued relevance, about the bonds between pilots and ground forces. She received letters from people she had never met, thanking her, praising her, asking for autographs. It was overwhelming and strange, and she retreated from it as much as she could, preferring the simplicity of the flight line to the complexity of public attention. But the story persisted, taking on a life of its own, growing beyond the facts into something almost mythical. The lone pilot who had defied the odds, the Valkyrie who rode into battle and emerged victorious. She understood that the story was no longer just about her. It was about something larger, something people needed to believe in. Years later, after her service had ended and she had returned to civilian life, Nora would look back on that night with a mixture of pride and humility. She had gone on to fly dozens more missions, to train younger pilots, to eventually become an instructor at the weapons school. But the valley remained the defining moment of her career, the thing she was known for, the story that followed her wherever she went. She accepted that, even embraced it, because she understood what it represented. It was proof that in the darkest moments, when everything seemed lost, one person with enough skill and courage and stubborn determination could make a difference. It was proof that the fight was not over until you decided it was over. And it was proof that the sky, for all its vastness and indifference, could still be commanded by someone who refused to give up. The A-10 Thunderbolt II remained in service, its retirement delayed again and again because no other aircraft could do what it did. Pilots still trained on it, still flew it into combat, still brought it home riddled with bullet holes and still flying. And when they did, they thought about stories like Nora Kine's, about the legacy of those who had flown before them, about the responsibility they carried. The Warthog was not just a machine. It was a promise, a contract written in steel and fire that said, "We will not leave you behind." And as long as that promise was kept, the aircraft would keep flying and the stories would keep being told, passed down from one generation of pilots to the next, a reminder of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to stand between the darkness and the light and refuse to yield. Nora Kine understood that. She had lived it, and she would carry it with her for the rest of her life.